Welcome to Charity Chats, where we look to discuss the latest issues facing the charity sector. I'm joined by my normal partners in crime, Catherine Ross-Jomji, Head of Charities at the legal firm Shakespeare Martineau, and James Saunders, a Charity Audit Partner at Moore Kingston Smith. So, I don't know about you guys, I attended the Charity Finance's annual trustee conference on Wednesday, called Trustee Exchange. I have to say it was another excellent event, and it had some really good sessions, and also got some great feedback, funnily enough, from the trustees attending. The keynote speech we had from James Timpson, who was talking about the culture of his business. And I have to say it was amazing. He keeps it very simple. He just talks about trust and kindness, and has two simple rules for his business, which is put the money in the till, sounds pretty obvious, and look the part, both the business and the people. And I have to say, if you've been into a Timpson's or into the dry cleaners or whatever that they are, and you certainly that comes across in spades. However, it did get me thinking about the way that we treat other people and the impact that has on us as individuals and on the organizations we represent. And I think it's something sort of fairly easy to forget about. I don't know whether you've come across that.
If it's all right, Catherine, I'll just pop in there, because it's an interesting point about keeping it simple. I mean, it makes it sound, simple. That's not my experience of particularly boards and committees recently. It's the other end of the scale. Actually, people are unfortunately getting themselves tied up in the need for controls and review processes, and that's very much, and that's been forced by a number of factors. I'm sure it's been forced by the regulators, not actively, but that need to comply with the regulations, internal controls around fraud prevention and anti-money laundering stuff, and all those sort of things. So I think that's a nice idea to have, but when you get into the granular, the nitty-gritty of it, it's very difficult to keep it that simple. There's always the need for controls and processes and everything else that makes life both a bit difficult and a bit impersonal.
It is interesting, isn't it? Because when I do trustee training, I talk about noses in, hands off. That you're meant to be having a look and overseeing, but not interfering. And I think that's the beautiful balance, but it's not easy to achieve. I think all of that, we don't want to micromanage, what a charity does and how it engages with those that it works with, but often that happens. And I think that's where we then lose that personal touch of actually we've forgotten what it is to treat people as individuals and to treat them with dignity and respect, I think. And there have been some stories this week, I think, where you sort of read it and think, oh, that was not a great tactic by a charity in behaving and conducting themselves in that way.
Yeah, and I think
it's often sector specific as well, isn't it, Charles? Sorry.
No,
I mean, I'm a school governor. We as governors are being, the responsibilities on us for safeguarding at the moment are growing every year. We need to attend courses in safeguarding and kids welfare and all that sort of stuff. And it is we are directly responsible in the end. This isn't one where you can hand off to a management team and say, we've got a high level review and the detail is somewhere else. The buck does stop with, particularly in safeguarding, with the governors of schools, and it's a very, it's a very onerous responsibility to have.
I think there's no doubt about it, and we'll come on to this because the Charity Commission, Helen Stevenson gave a talk, which will, I think this will cover this quite well. But James Timpson's obviously running a family business, so that they have a much more autonomy of what they can do, particularly as an individual, directing down on culture and the way that they go around employing people. And he talked about how they go into prisons, they don't look at CVs, they're looking at personalities, because actually they can teach. But I think actually it is, you're right, that increased regulation is making us more, I think, timid. I was going to say fearful, but timid in what we're doing. And sometimes we need to be braver and take a step back and actually look at not making things more complicated, but making them simpler, and probably being a bit brave about it. The other thing that came up, I sat in a session around cybersecurity. Absolutely staggering fact that global spending on cybersecurity is going to hit, or estimated to hit, 459 billion by 2025. And actually there was obviously a report in the press about 25% of charities have been subject to an attack last year. I suspect it's a lot higher than that. But actually, I think the key thing here was that the most vulnerable point is emails. I don't know if you're in audit coming across this more and more, James.
Yeah, I mean, it's just massive. I mean, we have spoken about this in previous sessions, and you know, the cases are coming through every week at the moment. We do know, you know, the government's done some work on this, and that, you know, there are some very not vulnerable sectors, but some areas that are some sectors that are really being targeted by these groups. Education is one of them. NHS is another one. Anything to do with public health. Anything where there's you know, vulnerable or easily accessible individual data being held. That, I mean, that's where these ransomers, these hijackers, these data hijackers can really make their money. Is where you've got kids' data, parents' data with schools, with patients' data with the NHS and the public sector. Anything where there's you know, a lot of personal data held and potentially confidential or dangerous, you know, dangerous to lose data. That's where they're going to be targeting. So those sort of organisations really need to be on top of their game, even more so than everyone else these days.
No, I think that's absolutely right. The other session I sat in was about reviewing the governance code. So a question to both of you is there, if you were sitting on the committee, are there any particular issues that you think should be covered in the next review?
I don't. I always think I lack imagination when I look at it and go, I don't feel there's a gaping hole. I don't feel that we're missing a trick. We've got to change this one completely or add an 8th pillar. I think there are 7 pillars. And for me, it's more about reinforcing what's already there, trying to make it more accessible. Sometimes I think the wording in it, clients will say to me, it's not very clearly written. If you try and turn each of the points into a question so that the trustees can evaluate the charity, they were saying it doesn't really lend itself to what do they mean by that. But that would just be wordsmithing. It wouldn't be any overhaul completely or drastic changes for me.
My colleague, my partner at Kingston Smith, Luke Holt, is a you know, a big governance specialist. I think last time we spoke, he said that the stuff about equality, diversity, and inclusivity, and Catherine would say equity rather than equality, but that's an area which is always going to have more development. It was underdeveloped to start with. It got a good refresh. It will need more, as firstly as time goes by, and secondly as attention grows in that area. And indeed, you know, charities members, they're all advancing in these areas. So if the governance code is a challenge to them, it has to develop alongside that. I don't think there's any doubt the charity sector does well with governance. You know, it is a well, you know, it manages governance very well, far better than the equivalent commercial corporate organisations. And a lot of that is to do with the fact there's a sort, there's a code, but there is public money at hand, and so the regulations, of course, have to be that much stricter. But the governance code will be a challenge, you know, to everyone. You've got to up your game each time. There's no point in the governance code coming out and saying everyone's doing everything well. They, you know, every time you need to push harder. So yeah, it's always a good thing to have that challenge.
So yeah, so they floated a number of ideas around executive pay, ESG and the environment, and what are the other issues that they were? Well, definitely equality, diversity, and inclusion. I have to say, what was really interesting, we had a show of hands who've used it, only about 50% of the audience, which I was expecting to be much higher, particularly as you bet people attending these sorts of conferences. And actually the comments coming back from the floor were very much about don't tinker, you should go out and encourage people to use it more. And also remain very focused. So don't get involved into things that are already being covered elsewhere. So things like the ESG and the environmental bit, which I think is, you know, executive salaries. Well, I think that is, and keep it simple. I also took the opportunity to say that I didn't understand why they had large and small, and in fact they did acknowledge that that was something they would look at combining into one, because I just thought, having read both, couldn't see the difference between the two. So the other thing, we had a closing speech from Helen Stevenson, CEO of the Charity Commission, who gave us an update of what they're doing. And I have to say the tone has completely changed from when Baroness Stowell, which I have to say she was talking much more working in partnership with trustees and improving their guidance on the thing. But of course, the headlines in the press the next day was that her recommendation was not to weaponize the Charity Commission as a tactic to settle trustee disputes. So I don't know, one, whether you guys had looked at any of the new guidance on the thing, have got any comment on that, or about the weaponisation of the Charity Commission.
It's so unfortunate, isn't it, where she's probably thinking that whole speech, and that's the thing they pick up on. I mean, I do think it's an issue. You know, I think there are, whether they're warring factions, if we're keeping the weapon theme, but, you know, these disputes amongst trustees, amongst members, we're seeing it more with religious charities as well. You know, it takes a lot of time up at the Charity Commission. And I think, you know, the Commission does need to maintain its distance, actually, to say we're the regulator. And they used to, I thought, be a bit stricter about this and say, we will not mediate. We are not here to settle disputes. Internal disputes are not for us. That's not a regulatory issue. So then they shouldn't be used in that way. I think the interesting bit I read in her speech was that she was saying only a third of trustees are accessing the guidance. And I was just thinking, how do you know? Because I'm accessing the guidance all the time. I'm a trustee of 2 charities. Do my charities get a tick when I access that? I don't think so. I don't think they have the means to know that. But yes, I thought her message was a good one. There's great guidance. You should read it. But I just wasn't sure it's only a third that are accessing that.
What about you, James?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is that tendency more and more these days for, if there is disagreement, to fall back on that, well, the Charity Commission says, or, well, the Charity Commission would say, I'm sure, you know, it's become one of those kind of easy win scenarios. I think it's very difficult to argue with someone who comes up with that in a discussion. I haven't seen it very often. I have seen it on occasions. I think on those occasions, generally, I probably wouldn't agree that it's a Charity Commission matter.
Yeah.
I must admit, I think it's good that they've changed their tone. I still think they need to remind everybody that they are a regulator and that's their job. I think their guidance has certainly improved, but they're not there to advise in the respect is provide guidance and advice, yes, but they're not an advisory in that capacity. And from my experience as a trustee, there are a lot of occasions where I wish they were being a bit more robust and less fearful of failing. You do get the sense that they are more cautious than they need to be, and like anybody, they're human and they are going to make mistakes. And actually, I think it'd be better off standing up and admitting that they have made mistakes and that they are human. I think they'd be a much stronger regulator as a basis on that. And then the final thing, which I have to say was the best session I attended, was around John Williams, who'd been chair of the Association of Chairs. And I think chair of a number of organizations, and gave us his 10 top tips of being a good chair. Now, so I'm going to ask you both about what you think are the top tips, not necessarily top 10, of being a good chair, whether it's of a committee or of a board.
I think it's that getting the balance between not being too formal but not being flippant. I think being encouraging, bringing people in, taking people with you. I think there is the bit about reading the room. I think some chairs you just look and think it's the equivalent of being tone deaf, but visually, where you just think this group is no longer with you. You know, they're losing the will to live. Let's move this along. And I think there is that sort of drive. I think sometimes it's tricky. It's putting people on the spot. It's trying to seek, you know, to get agreement on things where people might be talking at odds with each other. Tricky, but, you know, can be done. And I think when you see it done well, it's brilliant. You know, it's a really important role within a charity, but I think it's all the nuances of it depends who you're dealing with, whether every tactic would work with that particular group.
Yeah, I think it's keeping on track personally. I think that timing, but particularly subject matter, you are not there to make the decisions. You are not there to, you know, to lead discussions. I don't think you're there to manage them. You know, when all said and done, it's got to be collaborative, but you've got to, you know, losing the subject is so dangerous for committees. You know, the volunteers, time is precious. You can't afford for people to go off on tangents the whole time. So yeah, it's keeping people on track and keeping time on track.
Yeah, I think the other things he added in, which I would agree, is cherish your CEO. You know, other than being critical friend, you know, be supportive. I think be respectful to all, so say thank you more. not just as to your senior management staff, but also to people working, volunteers and everything else. And the other thing is being curious and willing to learn. Anyway, I think that sort of draws a close to our session. We've had a canter through a number of topics, including the weaponisation of the Charity Commission.